Every time we hit the road, whether that's on sealed tarmac, gravel, rocks, sand, mud or through water, there's only a small portion of each tyre that determines whether or not we have traction in that driving scenario. Tyres are probably the single most important part of any vehicle, but even more so for a four-wheel drive or touring vehicle. Why? Well, because along with on-road traction and handling, we need to consider off-road traction and handling, along with the strength and resilience of that tyre. We take these vehicles to some of the most remote parts of the country, and with that, we rely on these and the air within that rubber to get us there and back again safely. It's been 10,000 kilometers now since I fitted the Maxxis RAZR mud terrains to my Land Cruiser, and it's time now for a short-term review based on my experience. In this episode, we're going to be covering the tyre itself, the tread wear patterns, the on-road performance, the off-road performance, the strength and resilience, including that of the sidewall, of course the fuel economy, my thoughts, and whether or not I would fit them again moving forward. Now, of course, you can watch the whole review, but if you are looking for a specific piece of information, check out the timestamped chapters down below. First up, the tyre itself. Now, of course, this is a Maxxis RAZR mud terrain tyre, and the size I selected was a 285/65/18, which equates to about 32.6 inches. These are fitted to my 2014 Toyota Land Cruiser Sahara model with the KDSS suspension arms, and are wrapped around a Method NV305 matte black racing wheel, which is an 18x9 inch wide rim, sitting at a positive 25mm offset. With all of those specifications listed, overall I'm happy with the way the vehicle sits. Although personally I certainly notice the smaller size in this set when compared to my previous tyres, I don't think they look out of place. In addition to that, there's no scrubbing, fouling or rubbing anywhere in this combination. Now, this is only a 10,000 kilometer review, so it's a relatively short testing time, and in my circumstance we're travelling out of this Land Cruiser full time with my family, towing a 3.2 tonne hybrid camper. So I had these tyres fitted back in Cairns in Queensland. I have driven all the way across into the Northern Territory and to Darwin. Now, of course, we haven't stayed on the blacktop for this trip. We have taken these tyres through the Daintree Forest, crossing fords, rocky rivers and dry sandy riverbeds. We have driven one of the most famous tracks in Australia, of course being the old Telegraph Line, and towed our camper to the tip of Cape York. Coming back down again, we mixed the Peninsula Development Road with tarmac, more private station tracks and the rocky and corrugated Savannah Way. All in all, I think these tyres have been subjected to their fair amount of abuse in some rough and rugged terrain, but I will admit they've only been used a handful of times in mud. So firstly, and probably most notably, is tread wear. How a tyre wears and how quickly the tread wears down are two very important factors when deciding what tyres to buy for your setup. Tyre wear provides a good indication of things that may be going wrong, or perhaps a wheel alignment that has come out of spec. Personally, I've observed these tyres to wear down evenly. I haven't seen any scalloping, no uneven wear between the tread blocks or from side to side. Of course, my setup was freshly aligned when the tyres were fitted, and I'm careful with my tyre pressures given changing terrains. This being said, I'm confident in saying that because, well, they sure have worn down in this very short period of 10,000 kilometers. Now, when purchasing these tyres, of course, I bought a set of 5, and the 5th one is up here as a spare and has never seen any sort of terrain underneath the Cruiser. So as it sits here brand new, we can see that it pulls in about 14mm of tread depth, and these lugs on the tread are really sharp and aggressive looking. Now, just quickly, I'm using this ruler here which has a void space of about 4.5mm before the measurements even start. So although it reads just under 10mm on the ruler's edge, we need to add that 4.5mm to the total. So moving down to one of the front tyres, we are only seeing about 10mm remaining, and just after 11mm remaining on the rear. The loss of 4mm of tread depth on the tyres underneath the Cruiser is not to be dismissed. To be honest, that's quite a bit faster than I'd hoped for in a short term of only 10,000 kilometers. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand that these are a very aggressive tyre and there's less surface area coming into contact with the road, therefore there will be accelerated wear and tear, but there's a sobering reality dawns as I calculate how soon I'll need something new. Now, if the wear pattern on these tyres is linear, meaning that if I roughly lose 4mm of tread per every 10,000 kilometers, then I'm looking at only getting a life of 35,000 kilometers from this set of tyres, leaving me with 2mm remaining at the end, which is a little bit concerning. Two important points to note about this projection though is, one, it's not taking into consideration a 5-wheel rotation on a periodic basis, and secondly, as these lugs start to wear down, they actually become larger in their surface area. So theoretically, they should wear down a little bit slower. Now the tread wear in terms of the depth is just one element to how these tyres wear and how well they have performed. We also have to talk about the condition of the tyre structure and the lug integrity after some of the abuse that I've put them through. But before we get onto that, let's talk a little bit about how they've performed. So let's start with the boring stuff, the on-road performance. Now it's not exactly where you'd expect or plan to see a mud terrain tyre, but let's face it, even those who have dedicated four-wheel drives will still spend some time on the sealed stuff. Now personally, I am very careful with my tyre pressures. I always alter them depending on the terrains and the conditions, but generally, if I'm unhitched from our camper and just driving the cruiser around on road, I'll be sitting at about 38 PSI on all four tyres. When hitching up our 3.2 tonne camper, adding 270 kilos of downbore weight on the tow bar, I'll change that to 42 PSI on the front and 48 PSI on the rear. Now I've broken the on-road review down into three different categories. The first one is on-road handling. Now I'd say with the handling of the Maxxis mud terrains is more than adequate. Nothing exceptional, and the reason I say that is because I've come from a reputable all-terrain brand before this set of tyres, and I definitely noticed a bit of a difference. The new mud terrain becomes just a little floaty on the road surface. I can feel just a little slack in the steering, and it has taken away a little bit of that firm and accurate feeling. I will mention and admit that this is being very critical of these tyres. There's never been a time that I have felt uneasy or unable to control the vehicle in either an unloaded or loaded condition, but there is definitely a difference between the previous all-terrains and these new mud terrains nevertheless. The second part of this review is on-road traction. Now I moved from an all-terrain set, and as they started to wear down, they were terrible at traction on sealed surfaces. But switching over to these RAZR mud terrains, it's filled me with confidence once again. Whether I'm accelerating hard with the trailer in tow and de-weighting that front axle, or braking hard, these tyres are right up there with some of the best traction tyres I've used on this vehicle. And this is included in wet conditions too. I'm yet to lose traction or discover any difficulties in the traction department in the wet. Now there was one instance I recorded on the Bloomfield track that I observed the slightest wheel slip on the front axle. A little bit of loss of traction on the front wheels. But this scenario was in low range at full load, towing the camper up a 31% incline. So it sort of gives you a bit of an idea about just how well these tyres gripped to a sealed surface. And of course, the third on-road review is going to be noise. Everyone wants to know about just how noisy mud terrain tyres, and in particular, the Maxxis RAZRs are on road. For me, I definitely noticed a difference changing from the all-terrains to the mud terrains. There's no doubt about that, but there are just a couple of points to consider as well. Firstly, the 200 series Land Cruiser is a very well insulated and soundproofed vehicle. So although I'm saying that there was only a small increase in the volume, this may be different if you're driving a different type of vehicle. Secondly, I'm used to noise in the cab of my vehicle. The Land Cruiser is certainly a peaceful and comfortable drive from factory. I've added the roof rack wind noise, intake sounds from a 4-inch snorkel, and of course, most noticeably, a twin 4-inch into single 3-inch exhaust running through a single center muffler. The exhaust in particular is definitely an individual taste, and although definitely noisier in the cab, something I would never change. If you're running more of a stock Land Cruiser 200 series, then perhaps you might notice the volume increase just that little bit more. But I will say this, although a lot of people are worried and concerned about the noise level that these tyres emit, it is something that comes with the territory of changing to a mud terrain style, regardless of the brand. This is a good time for you to let me know what your experiences are with mud terrain tyres. How have you found the tyres on the road or off-road? Or perhaps you're looking at buying them. Are these sort of observations something that you would expect from a mud terrain tyre? Let us know in the comment section below. So let's move on to the off-road performance. The reason that we all purchase a tyre as aggressive as this. And we'll break the review down in terms of varying terrain conditions, starting with high-speed gravel. High-speed gravel is going to be a large part of the driving that us four-wheel drivers do. Whether it be in between tracks or out to remote campsites, for me, this tyre has performed well. And in fact, I enjoy the mud terrain on the gravel roads because they are less likely to pick up, throw, and hold stones in between these lugs. The high traction that I've experienced on-road has also transferred to high-speed gravel too. Corners on unpaved roads have been no problem for the Cruiser, and there have definitely been circumstances where I know that my previous ATs may have just started to let go. So moving on to sand, and I'll be the first to admit that I really haven't put these tyres to the test in the last 10,000 kilometres in some really soft and boggy sand. Now of course there was some sandy patches on the old Telegraph line up in Cape York. This mixed with some dry sandy riverbeds and some sandy based river crossings has given me a little bit of experience, but I'd be jumping the gun to provide an in-depth review on how these perform given my limited experience. This being the case, that limited experience I have had has been positive. Now there were sections of the OTL I had these tyres lowered all the way down to 14 PSI, particularly for those sandy river bases, and the tyre performed well. There was no breaking of the bead, slipping of the rim, and the traction was more than adequate for the circumstances. So what about rocks and hard packed terrain? Well, generally mud terrain tyres have quite a stiff and rigid sidewall. They don't quite bag out and soften up as much as some all-terrains or some softer compound tyres. And when you're traversing rocks and slow hard packed terrain, that's what you want. You want a nice spongy tyre that can form and mould around some of the obstacles to provide the best traction and the best puncture resistance. Now my observation is that these don't quite bag out quite as much as my previous all-terrains. However, keeping in mind that they do have a smaller sidewall given that smaller overall diameter. Just like sand, I haven't experienced lots of rocky terrain, more river rocks and slow going undulating terrain in which these tyres have performed well. These tyres have also excelled in hard packed terrain like dirt and sand covered rocks. As my previous all-terrains wore down, they became horrible in shaly or hard packed terrain, and the comparison here is black and white. The mud terrains have far more grip. Finally, mud. I mean, this is the reason that we purchase a tyre like this in the end, right? Now, I'll admit I haven't done hundreds and hundreds of kilometres of mud driving, but what driving I have done in that sloppy stuff, I have been very impressed. Primarily, the most experience I've had was the old Telegraph line up in Cape York in between some of those river crossings. And I want to play you a clip here from one of those crossings in particular. This here shows just how well these tyres can bite into sloppy, muddy terrain. At the start of the clip, I've rolled up to the ruts and we can see the gaps in between the tyres' lugs are full of mud, essentially taking away that sharp and aggressive biting edge. Now, as soon as I've accelerated, and only gently at that, we can see that mud fling out, bringing back that sharp and aggressive edge, and it's evident how much that has assisted the vehicle's traction. I didn't have to spin the tyre much to get the vehicle moving forward, and it was a relatively easy climb up and out of that exit. So just as in this clip, each time I drive through conditions like this, I've been impressed by just how much traction this tyre can find, and I'm yet to find a fault with it in this type of terrain. So moving on to the sidewall of this RAZR. Now, just as important as the tread that is in contact with the road at all times, the sidewall is a very important part of any four-wheel drive tyre. This sidewall here has to stand up to and resist punctures in testing conditions, testing terrains, and potentially at very low pressures. As I mentioned earlier, generally mud terrain tyres have a stiffer and harder sidewall, which means they don't quite conform so much to the terrain you're driving upon, which sometimes means that we have to lower those pressures even further than we would with an all-terrain or a regular highway terrain tyre. As mentioned, there were times on the OTL that I lowered my pressures down to 14 PSI. And on this particular entry into a river crossing, the rear driver's sidewall was put under huge stress as it flexed and deformed under the heavy weight of the cruiser. Although we pushed through this difficult terrain at low pressure, the sidewall stood up well without breaking the bead, slipping on the wheel, or becoming damaged. In addition to that, the exterior design of a tyre's sidewall is also quite important. And here on the RAZRs, we see these large and bold lugs on the sidewall. This is quite important, particularly as we bog down into deep and sloppy mud. These lugs are going to be able to help you with some additional traction. Before buying these tyres, I had read some reports that some users were experiencing some sidewall memory when the vehicle was parked up overnight or for a couple of days, and then experiencing some vibrations as the lumps move around on the tyre until they warmed up. Now, I can say from my experience in the last 10,000 kilometers, I have not experienced this at all, and every time I've gone to get into the vehicle and started driving, it's always felt smooth and planted. Now, as the sidewall is a little stiffer, here's a bit of a comparison in the way in which the tyre bags out as we take pressure out. Starting here at 45 PSI, moving down to 38 PSI, 30 psi, 25 psi, 20 psi, 15 psi, 10 psi, and finally 5 psi. Now yes, I have found this sidewall to be a little bit stiffer and more rigid, but saying that, I haven't found this to be an issue, as anytime I need that maximum traction, I can always take out just a little bit more pressure, and they seem to perform very well. So as I mentioned earlier, the tread wear pattern is only one element of how well a tyre performs overall. Some tyres are very easily damaged by rocky and rough terrains, but in my experience, most commonly high-speed gravel roads that consist of large, sharp and shaly rocks. Now I've had plenty of tyres in the past, and I've even had a couple of sets that have been so weak that entire lugs have ripped and departed from the tyre in these conditions, exposing the carcass underneath. Now, although I've only done 10,000 kilometers with these particular tyres, we have spent a fair bit of that time on high-speed gravel, corrugations, and that rocky and shaly type of terrain. And to be honest, I have been very impressed with how well these tyres have held up. I've gone looking around the set and only really found a couple of minor areas of damage. Here we see the small chunk taken out from the rear driver's side. Overall, I've really struggled to find any evidence of anything that would be concerning. There's no cuts, divots, chunks, scratches taken out of these tyres, nothing more than you would expect in 10,000 kilometers. In addition to this, there's been no dramas with any of these tyres holding air in their beads, and obviously I've experienced no punctures thus far. Another very popular topic for these style of tyres is of course fuel economy. We all know that mud terrain tyres do nothing to assist your fuel economy, but unfortunately it's something that I've been unable to directly compare in my testing. That's because I've chosen to go for a smaller tyre size with this set. I've dropped almost an inch in overall diameter going from my previous all-terrains to my mud terrains, but I have no doubt that choosing something less aggressive would have been better off if that was my priority. Now, personally, I've experienced a 1 litre per 100 kilometre benefit from fitting these tyres, but I'm not living under any false pretense. That is solely down to the size of this tyre. But the stiffer, heavier and more aggressive styling of this tyre is sure not going to help you out. So if you're looking for something to prioritise your fuel consumption, then a tyre like this is probably not the way to go. Now, I've been very impressed with the Maxxis RAZR mud terrains in almost every scenario that I've put them through. I've managed to avoid any deep boggings, I haven't received any damage or punctures, and been very impressed with their off-road performance. But this all being said, I've had to live with just a few negatives, and this of course has been that slight increase in the noise, that small change or less accurate feel in the steering, and of course that very quick tread wear. I'll be the first to admit that the driving style and the lifestyle that I'm currently putting these tyres through is definitely defined as that of touring. Large distances with a very heavy combination, driving the entire way around the country on primarily sealed and hard packed gravel roads is not exactly where you'd expect to see a mud terrain tyre excel. But this begs the question, would I do it again with the experience I've had in the last 10,000 kilometres? In all honesty, it's just a little bit too early to tell. I have genuinely been very impressed by all aspects of this tyre except for the tread wear depth. I'm happy to accept the small increase in noise and that slight change in the steering, which to be honest, the vast majority, including myself, wouldn't worry about, but losing 4mm of tread depth in only 10,000 kilometres is just a little bit concerning. I'm happy to pay for good quality and good performance tyres, and these tyres here appear to be of good quality and they have performed very well. But if I'm only going to receive about 35,000 kilometres of useful life from this set, well, that is going to be a bit of a deal breaker. Now, time will tell as to whether or not these tyres will wear as quickly as predicted or projected from what we have currently seen. And I'm just about to head in to get a 5-wheel rotation, a balance and alignment to best look after these tyres to complete a long-term test. Now, although I'm touring on the road full time now, generally this cruiser is parked up in a garage and only used for off-roading and camping trips on regular breaks. So it might only see 20 to 30,000 kilometers per year, and it might be more value for money or more beneficial to use these tires in that circumstance. But again, time will tell as to how these tires wear, how they perform as they start to wear, and we still have about 10 to 15,000 kilometers left on this particular trip before it comes to an end. In my experience with that limited 10,000 kilometers on this set of tires, the jury is still out as to whether or not I'd recommend them long term. If you're looking for a good quality and high performing off-road tyre for a particular trip, then absolutely these have performed very, very well. But how they wear long term and for a touring basis, well, I'm still yet to decide whether or not it's something that I would recommend and something that I'll continue to do after this set has worn out. But either way, I hope this information in this particular episode has provided you with useful information that can help you make an educated decision as to whether or not a set of Maxxis tyres or even a set of mud terrain tyres in general is going to be for you. Regardless of whether we see you out on the road or not, we'll make sure to see you here in the next episode of Exploring Oz. Cheers.